She married me for the land. I made sure she left with nothing. I want to tell you about the morning I found the document, not the morning of the court hearing. When everything became public and the full shape of what had been built against me was visible to anyone in the room with eyes and a working knowledge of property law. Not the morning my solicitor called to tell me that the family court had received an asset disclosure that misrepresented, in ways that were either grossly incompetent or deliberately fraudulent. The ownership structure of 4 separate land parcels that I had spent 11 years acquiring. Not any of those mornings, though each of them was its own particular kind of damage. I want to tell you about the Tuesday in July, a year before any of it became public, when I found the document in the drawer of the desk in the study of the house in Turak, a house I had bought for us, with my money. That had my name on the title that told me everything I needed to know about what my marriage actually was. The document was a letter, handwritten, on paper I didn't recognize, in my wife's handwriting. It was addressed to her father, Russell Whitmore. It was dated 14 months earlier, which placed it approximately 8 months after our wedding. It said, "Dad, he's agreed to the trust structure you suggested. He doesn't understand what it means yet. Give it 12 months, maybe 18, and then we move. Call me when you're back from Broome." 37 words. I read them twice. Then I folded the letter along its original crease and put it back in the drawer exactly as I had found it. I walked out of the study. I went to the kitchen. I made a cup of tea I didn't drink. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden, a good garden, carefully maintained by a man named Gary, who came every second Thursday. And I thought about what 37 words actually meant when you had the context to read them correctly. The context was this: the trust structure that Diana had suggested I agree to presented to me 8 months into our marriage, as a sensible estate planning measure recommended by her father's financial advisor, had restructured the ownership of 3 of my 4 land parcels through a family trust in which Diana held. As I had understood it, a minority beneficiary interest alongside me. What I had not understood, what I was now beginning to understand. Standing at the kitchen window with a cup of tea going cold, was that the specific structure of the trust, as drafted by a solicitor I had never met, and whose name I had signed documents for on Diana's assurance that he came highly recommended, may have given her a position in the trust's governance that was considerably more significant than the minority beneficiary interest I believed I had agreed to. I was a mining man, not a lawyer. I had spent 20 years in the Pilbara and in Western Australia's goldfields, building a land and resource position that was. By the time I met Diana Whitmore at a function in Perth, worth somewhere between $40 and $60 million, depending on how you valued the undeveloped parcels and what you thought was in the ground beneath them. I understood geology, and I understood operations, and I understood the specific, hard-won knowledge of where value was and how to extract it. I did not understand trust law in any detail, and I had never needed to, because I had spent 20 years trusting the people I needed to trust with the things I didn't understand, and managing the things I did understand myself. Diana had known this. Her father had known it. And they had. I was beginning to understand at the kitchen window on a Tuesday in July. Built their plan on exactly that knowledge. I finished thinking, I poured the tea down the sink. I went upstairs, got my phone, and called my solicitor, not the one Diana had introduced me to, but my original solicitor, a man named Peter Carmichael, who had been handling my property transactions for 12 years, and who answered his phone even on Tuesdays at 11 in the morning with the focused attention of someone who understood that his clients called when they needed him. I said, Peter, I need you to pull the trust documents from the Hargrove Family Trust, all of them. I need you to read them as if someone was trying to use them against me, and I need you to call me back today. He said, I'll call you back this afternoon. He called back at 3. He said, James, where are you? I said, at home. He said, is Diana there? I said, no. She's in Sydney with her mother until Thursday. He said, all right. I need you to come into the office. What I have to tell you is not a phone conversation. I went into the office. He told me what the trust documents actually said. I listened for 40 minutes without interrupting, which is one of the things that 20 years in the mining industry had taught me, that when someone who knows something you don't is telling you what they know, the single most valuable thing you can do is be completely quiet and listen. When he finished, I said, how bad is it? He said the structure gives Diana effective control over the disposition of the trust's assets in the event of a relationship breakdown. Her minority beneficiary interest is nominal. The governance structure is the issue. She has a casting vote on the trustee panel that, in a contested situation, would give her the power to block distributions and potentially to direct asset sales. I said, can it be unwound? He said it depends on when and how. There are legal mechanisms, but it will be contested, and it will be expensive, and it will require us to demonstrate that the original structure was entered into under conditions that warrant setting it aside. I said, can we demonstrate that? He paused. He said, the letter you found is evidence of intent, but intent alone is not sufficient. We need to understand the full scope of what's been planned, and we need to understand it before they move. Whatever moving means in the context of their plan. I looked at him across the desk. Peter Carmichael was 61 years old and had been a property solicitor in Melbourne for 35 years. He was not a man who used words carelessly. I said, you think they're planning a divorce? He said, I think they're planning a divorce that is designed to give Diana and her father the maximum possible share of your asset base. The trust structure is the mechanism. I think the letter you found is evidence that this has been the plan since shortly after you were married. I think you need to understand exactly what you're dealing with before you do anything at all. I said, how long do I have? He said, I don't know. The letter said 12 to 18 months. You found it 14 months in, which means if they're on schedule, you may have very little time. I looked at him. I said, tell me what we need to do. He told me. I listened. And then I went home to the house in Toorak that I had bought with my money. And I sat in the kitchen of that house, and I thought about what Diana Whitmore had said to me on the night we met. At a function in Perth, where I had been wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, because I spent most of my life in work clothes, and where she had looked at me across a room of people in better suits, and walked over and said, you look like a man who built something. Tell me what you built. I had told her. I had told her everything. That night. With the openness of a person who was not accustomed to being asked, and who found, when asked by the right person, that he had more to say than he had realized. She had listened with the complete attention of someone who was very interested in what she was hearing. I understood now what she had been interested in. I want to tell you about Diana Whitmore before I tell you about what came after. because understanding her correctly is the key to understanding what the 2 years required of me and what they were actually about. Diana was 34 years old when we met. She was the third of Russell Whitmore's 4 children. And she was, of the 4, the one who had inherited most completely the specific quality that defined Russell, the ability to appear to be one thing while being another, with sufficient skill and consistency that the appearance could be sustained across extended periods and close relationships without the seam becoming visible. Russell Whitmore was a man who had built a modest property development business in Perth across 30 years, who had built it through a combination of genuine capability and the specific kind of unscrupulous dealing that the Western Australian property market had, at various points in its history, rewarded rather than punished. He was not wealthy by the standards of the people he wanted to be associated with, but he was wealthy enough to present himself plausibly at the functions and the golf clubs and the charity dinners where the genuinely wealthy gathered. And the presentation had been, over 30 years, careful enough that the gap between the presentation and the reality was not immediately obvious to people who had not been in business with him. I had not been in business with him. I had met him 5 times before I married his daughter, each time in the context of social occasions where the conversation was friendly and general, and where nothing Russell said or did gave me reason to examine him more carefully than a man examines his future father-in-law in the ordinary course of becoming part of a family. I should have examined him more carefully. I knew this by the time I sat in Peter Carmichael's office and understood what the trust document said. I had not examined him carefully because Diana had, from the beginning of the relationship, managed the way I experienced her family with a subtlety that I had not identified as management, because it had not felt like management. It had felt like the natural organization of social situations by a woman who was good at social situations and who wanted them to go well. This was one of Diana's genuine qualities. She was excellent at managing the way people experienced things, not through deception in the crude sense, not through obvious manipulation or transparent performance, through the more sophisticated and more difficult practice of shaping the context in which events occurred, so that the events were experienced differently than they would have been experienced in a different context. A dinner at which Russell's past business failures might have been discussed occurred instead as a pleasant evening at which Russell was charming and knowledgeable and interested, and the subject of past failures simply did not arise, not because it was avoided, but because Diana had structured the evening so thoroughly around other things that its absence felt natural rather than deliberate, I had thought. During the 18 months of our relationship before the wedding and the 14 months of marriage before the Tuesday in July, that I had a reasonable understanding of the woman I was with. I was in love with her, which is a condition that I want to describe accurately rather than either romantically or cynically. Being in love with Diana Whitmore had not made me stupid. I had not ignored things I should have paid attention to, had not failed to notice signs that should have alarmed me. Being in love with her had simply placed my attention where she directed it, and she directed it with great skill, away from the things that would have told me what I needed to know. By the Tuesday in July, I was no longer in love with her. That is not what I felt at the kitchen window with the cup of tea going cold. What I felt was the specific cold clarity of a person who has understood something that changes the frame around everything they thought they understood. Not anger, the anger came later, in the weeks that followed, as the full scope of what had been planned became more visible. What I felt first was clarity. The particular cold clarity of a person who has been operating in the wrong frame and who has just had the frame corrected. I was grateful for the clarity. It was the most useful thing the Tuesday in July gave me. And it was more useful than anything I had felt in the preceding 14 months. I want to tell you about the land because the land is the heart of the story, and because a person who doesn't understand the land doesn't understand what was at stake or what the fight was actually about. I had inherited two things from my father when he died. 23 years ago, at 61 years old, in a hospital in Kalgoorlie, where he had been admitted for what turned out to be a heart condition that had been developing for a decade, and that nobody, including my father, had taken seriously enough to manage. He left me $400,000 in cash savings and a 320-acre property near Menzies in the Western Australian goldfields that he had acquired in the mid-1970s as a speculation that had never quite paid off in the way he had hoped. The $400,000 I used to buy equipment and fund the first 2 years of the mining consultancy business that I started at 28. The year after my father died, the Menzies property I kept because it was the thing my father had most wanted to keep, and because I was not. In those early years, in a position to do much with it anyway, over the following 20 years, I built the consultancy into something real, not a large company. Never more than 12 people. But a company with a specific edge in the identification and assessment of undervalued mineral exploration tenements that had, over 2 decades, generated enough revenue and enough successful client outcomes that my own reputation was the most valuable thing I owned. The reputation generated work. The work generated income. The income went into land. The land is what I want to describe, because the land was not, to me, primarily an investment. It was something more specific and harder to explain to a person who has not spent 20 years in the Western Australian outback, moving between properties and tenements and exploration sites, understanding the country in the specific way that comes from walking it and reading it and thinking about what is underneath it. The Menzies property was the first. I had been walking it since I was a boy, with my father, learning the specific vocabulary of that particular landscape, the breakaways and the mulga and the dry creek beds and the clay pans and the occasional patches of greenery that announced, to a person who knew how to read them, the presence of water or the specific soil chemistry that suggested mineralization at depth. By the time I inherited it, I knew the property the way you know a thing you have paid attention to for 20 years, not completely, but specifically. With the accumulated detail of sustained attention rather than the general outline of occasional visits, I acquired the second property, a 1,200-acre holding near Laverton, in my 13th year of business, when the consultancy had generated enough surplus capital that I could act on the opportunity that arose when the previous owner needed to liquidate quickly and accept at a price that was, by my assessment of what was in the ground, significantly below value. The Laverton property had been, over the following 8 years, the most profitable land decision I had ever made. The lithium prospectivity that I had identified from the surface geology and the regional structural mapping was confirmed by drilling in year 3. The exploration tenements I had pegged over the lithium anomalies were, by the time of the Tuesday in July, the subject of active interest from 2 separate ASX-listed exploration companies. The 3rd and 4th properties were in South Australia and Victoria, respectively a pastoral lease east of Broken Hill that had grazing income and reasonable base metals prospectivity, and a 600-acre agricultural holding in the Wimmera that I had bought for the soil and the water access, and that had been returning modest but consistent agricultural income for 6 years combined. The 4 properties and the associated exploration tenements represented, by the most conservative assessment I could construct, an asset base of between $45 and $70 million. The width of the range reflected the uncertainty about the lithium tenement value, which was genuinely uncertain and which was the source of most of the disagreement about what I was worth. What Diana and Russell Whitmore had understood from the beginning was that the uncertainty about the lithium tenement value was the vulnerability in my position. If they could force a situation in which the asset base was assessed at the lower end of the range through a contested divorce proceeding that moved quickly, before the lithium tenement's value was confirmed by further drilling results, and that gave Diana's assessment of the assets the procedural advantage of being made first. The division they could achieve would be considerably more favorable to them than a division made after the lithium value was established. The trust structure was the mechanism, the timing was the strategy, and the thing they had not known, 14 months into the marriage, was that I had found the letter. I want to tell you about Russell Whitmore more fully, because he is the architect of what was done to me, and the architect deserves a complete account rather than a peripheral one. Russell was 63 years old when I married his daughter. He had the specific quality of a certain kind of Western Australian businessman, the self-made quality. The quality of a man who had built something without assistance and who wore the building as both credential and identity, who was most comfortable in rooms where he was the person who had done the most, and who found rooms where this was not the case to be occasions that required the specific effort of managing his own competitive instincts. He was not, by any measure I could apply, a straightforwardly dishonest man. He had not, as far as I was able to determine, done things in his business life that crossed the clear legal lines that most people understand as the boundary of acceptable conduct. What he had done was operate consistently in the gray areas, the areas where the letter of the law was technically complied with, and the spirit of it was not, where the disclosure was technically sufficient and the impression created was not accurate, where the agreement was legally binding and the understanding of one party was not what it appeared to be. This is a specific and recognizable type. In the world of property and resource development in Western Australia, I had encountered it before in business contexts, and had managed it by maintaining sufficient distance that the gray areas remained someone else's problem. I had not, in the context of the relationship with Diana, been sufficiently alert to the signs that the man whose daughter I was marrying was this type. Not because the signs weren't there in retrospect. They were. Because the context in which I encountered them, dinners, social occasions. The managed frame of Diana's presentation of her family did not trigger the same assessment instincts that a business context would have triggered. This was the specific blind spot that Diana and Russell had identified and exploited. And it was the blind spot I had to work around in the months after the Tuesday in July to build what the situation required. The decision to stay quiet was the hardest decision of the 2 years. And I want to tell you about it honestly, rather than presenting it as an obvious strategic choice that a reasonable person would have made without difficulty. It was not obvious. It was not without difficulty. And on the days when the cost of it was highest, the days when Diana was in the house and I was performing the husband she believed she still had. The days when Russell called and I spoke to him with the friendly ease of a son-in-law who had no idea what he knew. It was one of the most demanding things I have ever done. I had built my working life in conditions that required a specific kind of toughness. 20 years in the Western Australian outback, in heat that exceeded 45 degrees, and in conditions that were, by any urban measure, genuinely harsh, had given me a physical and psychological endurance that I was aware of, and that I had needed. This was different. The toughness required by the outback is the toughness of endurance, of continuing to function in conditions that are physically difficult. The toughness required by those 2 years was the toughness of performance, of functioning normally in the presence of people who had done something to you that they did not know you knew they had done. Endurance and performance are different. Endurance is a quality I had. Performance was a quality I had to develop. Peter Carmichael and I met weekly in his office, in meetings that were structured as routine property consultations. The kind of meetings that a man with a complex land portfolio has with his solicitor on a regular basis, and that attracted no comment from Diana. Who knew about the meetings, and who had? I had come to understand, assumed that the routine meetings were covering routine matters. What we discussed in those meetings was anything but routine. The core of what we were building across those weeks and months was an understanding of the full scope of what Diana and Russell had constructed, and a counterstructure that would dismantle it without alerting them that the dismantling was underway. The trust structure was the first problem. Peter engaged a specialist trust lawyer, a woman named Caroline Ng, who had spent 20 years unpicking complex trust structures in disputed family law proceedings, and who was, Peter told me, the person he would want on his side if the trust became the central battleground. Caroline reviewed the documents over 2 weeks and produced an analysis that confirmed Peter's initial assessment and added dimensions he had not identified. The governance structure that gave Diana effective control in a contested situation was real, but it was, Caroline concluded, built on a foundation that had 2 significant vulnerabilities. The first was a procedural deficiency in the way the original trust had been established, a specific requirement under Victorian trust law that had not been complied with, which gave grounds for challenging the validity of the trust instrument. The second was the evidence of intent, if we could establish that the trust had been established as part of a deliberate scheme to obtain a property settlement advantage in an anticipated divorce proceeding. The family court had the authority to set it aside as a sham transaction. The first vulnerability was technical and documentable. The second required evidence, and building the evidence required time and the careful accumulation of documentation that Diana and Russell were not aware was being accumulated. This was what the staying quiet was for. I want to tell you about what the 2 years looked like from the inside, because the strategic account I have given you is accurate, but incomplete. The strategy was real, and the strategy was necessary. But the 2 years were also a lived experience, and the lived experience had a texture that the strategic account does not capture. Diana and I continued to live together in the Turak house through most of those 2 years. This was, on one level, a strategic decision. Peter had advised that maintaining the appearance of a normal marriage for as long as possible was important for the reasons that the timing of their plan depended on. Reasons I will describe. But it was also simply the reality of a situation in which two people who were, on the surface, still married were still sharing a house. I want to be honest about what that was like. Diana was, during those 2 years, exactly who she had always appeared to be in the daily texture of life. She was organized and socially capable, and she made the household function with the efficiency of a person who had grown up in a household where functionality was valued. She cooked well on the evenings when we ate at home. She maintained the social calendar with the attention to detail that had always characterized her management of our social life. She was, in the immediate and visible dimensions of daily existence, a good companion. This was the hardest thing to hold simultaneously with what I knew. Not because it made me doubt what I knew. I did not doubt what I knew. The letter was unambiguous, and Peter's analysis of the trust documents was unambiguous, and the accumulating evidence of the broader scheme was unambiguous. But because the dailiness of it, the ordinary domestic texture of a marriage that was not what it appeared to be, had a specific and draining quality that was different from what I had expected when I had decided to stay quiet. I had expected the staying quiet to feel primarily strategic. I had not expected it to feel also lonely. Not the loneliness of a person who is isolated. I was not isolated. I had Peter and Caroline, and the investigators, and the work. And I had my own company, and my own thoughts, and the land, which I visited as often as the situation permitted, and which remained. Through all of it, the thing that most reliably returned me to myself, the loneliness of a person who is surrounded by the structures of a life that is not what it appears to be, and who cannot, for reasons that are strategically sound, but personally costly. Acknowledge this to the person sitting across the dinner table. I sat across the dinner table from Diana Whitmore for 2 years, and I had the ordinary conversations of a married couple, and I did not let anything show. This was the cost of those 2 years. I want to name it as a cost, because minimizing it would be dishonest. And because the people who will read this account, and who are considering their own difficult situations, deserve honesty about what difficult situations cost. It cost a great deal. I paid it because it was necessary, and because the alternative, moving too early, before the counterstructure was complete, would have produced a worse outcome. But I want to be clear that paying it was not easy, and that anyone who suggests it should have been easy understands something different about human beings than I do. The investigation that Peter commissioned through a firm of private inquiry agents in Melbourne that he had worked with in previous cases, and that was, he told me, the best available for this specific kind of work, produced its most important result in the 4th month. The inquiry agents had been tasked with two objectives. The first was to understand Russell Whitmore's financial position as completely as possible. Not what he presented publicly, but what the actual structure of his affairs looked like when examined carefully. The second was to identify any communications between Diana and Russell that were relevant to the scheme. The first objective produced a picture that was, in its specifics, considerably more useful than I had expected. Russell Whitmore's property development business was, by the investigation's findings, in significantly worse condition than its public presentation suggested. 3 of his 4 current development projects were financially distressed behind on construction financing, with settlement dates that were now looking uncertain given the rising interest rate environment. His personal balance sheet, which the investigators had assembled through careful analysis of public records and financial disclosures, suggested that his net worth was substantially less than the figure he presented in social settings, and that he was, in the specific language of the investigation report, illiquid. This was information I had not had. It was also, I understood immediately when I read the report, the additional piece of context that made the full shape of the scheme comprehensible. Russell Whitmore was not simply opportunistic. He was in financial difficulty, and the resolution of that difficulty was contingent, in significant part, on the successful execution of the scheme against me, a divorce settlement that gave Diana a substantial portion of my asset base would generate liquidity that Russell needed for his own position. The scheme was not only about Diana's long-term interests, it was about Russell's immediate financial survival. This changed my understanding of the timeline. A man in Russell's position was not going to be patient if his financial situation deteriorated further. The 18 months that the letter had suggested as the window might have shortened. We needed to move faster than the original plan had contemplated. I called Peter from the Laverton property, where I had driven for the weekend, ostensibly to check on some ongoing exploration work, and actually to be somewhere that was mine, and that reminded me of what I was protecting. I said the investigation's findings changed the timeline. We need to accelerate. Peter said how much. I said I don't know exactly. But I think Russell is under pressure, and I think the pressure will push Diana to move sooner than they originally planned. He said, "What are your instincts about Diana's awareness of her father's financial situation?" I thought about this. I said she knows. She may not know the details, but she knows he needs this to work. I've watched how she talks about the plan the few times she's said anything in front of me that referenced it, without knowing I understood what she was referencing. There's an urgency in it that she tries to conceal. Peter said, "All right, let me talk to Caroline. We may be able to compress the timeline on the trust challenge." He called me the following Monday. He said Caroline thinks we can be ready in 4 months if we push hard. The procedural deficiency in the trust instrument is clean enough that the challenge doesn't need the full evidentiary development we were planning for the intent argument. We can file on the procedural ground and hold the intent argument in reserve. I said, "What does filing on the procedural ground do?" He said it freezes the trust. Once the challenge is filed and the court makes an interim order, Diana cannot use the trust governance structure to affect the assets while the challenge is pending. It takes the primary mechanism off the table, I said. And then, he said, then we proceed with the full case, which includes the family court proceedings, which we also file simultaneously to ensure we're in front of the right judge for the asset division question, I said. And Diana and Russell. He said they will not see it coming in the way you're imagining. They know you're a careful man. They may have prepared for some level of legal resistance. What they have not prepared for is the specific combination of the trust challenge and the simultaneous family court filing and the investigation findings and the evidence of intent that we've now assembled. The combination is the thing that will catch them without adequate preparation. I said, when? He said, I'll have a date for you in 2 weeks. He had a date for me. Ready? I want to tell you about the last ordinary week before the filing, because that week was, in its specific texture, the most difficult of the 2 years. Diana and I had been invited to a dinner at the home of friends in South Yarra, a couple I genuinely liked, who had been part of our social world for the duration of the marriage, and who were, as far as I knew, uninvolved in anything related to the scheme. The dinner was scheduled for the Wednesday of the filing week. Peter had advised me to maintain absolutely normal behavior through the week of the filing. No changes to routine, no signs of agitation, no last-minute cancellations of social engagements. The filing was going to happen on the Friday, until Friday morning. Everything had to look like every other week. We went to the dinner on the Wednesday. It was a good dinner. Good food, good wine. The kind of easy and genuine conversation between people who have been friends long enough not to need to perform for each other. Diana was at her best in those settings, warm. Funny. The person who asked the right questions and listened with what seemed like complete attention. I watched her across the table and thought about what I knew and what she didn't know I knew and what Friday morning would bring. I was, through that dinner, the person she believed I was. Present. Engaged. The husband who had no idea what was coming. I sat across from my wife at a dinner table in South Yarra on a Wednesday evening and held 2 versions of the situation simultaneously, the version she was experiencing and the version I was experiencing. And I did not let anything cross from the second version into the first. On the drive home, she said that was lovely. We should see them more. I said yes, we should. We went home. We went to bed. I lay in the dark and thought about Friday morning. And about the 2 years. And about the Menzies property and the Laverton lithium and the $400,000 my father had left me and what he had built it from. And I was still for a long time. Thursday passed. I went to work. Diana had lunch with her mother. I had a final call with Peter at 4 in the afternoon to confirm that everything was in order. He said, we're ready. I said, I'm ready. We said goodnight. On Friday morning at 9 o'clock, Peter Carmichael filed the trust challenge in the Victorian Supreme Court and the family court proceeding simultaneously, and served both sets of documents on Diana's registered address and on Russell Whitmore's business address. I was at the Menzies property when it happened. Not by accident, I had driven up on Thursday evening. 400 kilometers north of Kalgoorlie, through the landscape that I had been walking since I was a boy. And I had spent Thursday night in the old station house that my father had built, and that I had maintained and slowly improved over 20 years. I woke on Friday morning to the dry cold of an outback winter dawn, and I stood outside the station house and looked at the landscape, the breakaways, and the mulga, and the pale blue of the sky coming up over the low hills to the east, and I waited for Peter's text. It came at 9:14. It said filed, served, ready when you are. I stood outside the station house for another few minutes. The land was very quiet. It is always quiet in the outback at dawn, in the specific way of places that are genuinely large, not the absence of sound, but the presence of a scale that makes ordinary sound feel brief and temporary. I have always found this quality useful for thinking, and I thought for a while, and then I went back inside and made breakfast. The situation was now in motion. Everything I had spent 2 years building was now engaged with everything they had spent 18 months building. And the thing about a contest between preparations is that the preparation you didn't know about is always the more powerful one. They had not known about mine. Diana called me at 11:47 on the Friday morning. I was still at the Menzies property. I had been expecting the call, and I had been thinking, for the preceding 2 hours, about exactly how I was going to handle it. She said, "James, I've just been served with court documents. Can you tell me what's going on?" Her voice was controlled. I want to give her credit for this, because it is accurate, and because accuracy requires acknowledging what she was genuinely capable of. She was a controlled person, and the control held in that moment. Mostly. But there was something under the control, a quality of the voice under the words that I had learned, in 2 years of careful listening, to identify. The quality that was there when what she was saying and what she was experiencing had a gap between them that the control was managing. I said, "Yes. I'll explain when I'm back in Melbourne. I'm at Manny's until Sunday." She said, "James, these documents say you're filing for divorce." I said, "Yes." A pause. She said, "I don't understand. Where is this coming from?" I said, "I'll explain Sunday." She said, "I need to understand what?" I said, "Diana, I'll be home Sunday. We'll talk then." I ended the call. I sat in the station house that my father had built, and I looked at the wall, and I thought about how the conversation had sounded, and about what it told me about where she was. The control had held. But the question, "I don't understand. Where is this coming from?" had the specific quality of someone who does not understand. Which was not what I had expected. I had expected something that sounded more like the question of someone who understood very well what was coming, but needed to perform not understanding. I called Peter. I said she called. She said she doesn't understand where it's coming from. She sounded genuinely surprised. Peter was quiet for a moment. He said she may genuinely not have been told the specific timing. Russell may have been managing the information sharing. I said, "You think Russell was running this more than Diana knew?" He said, "It's possible. Diana may have known the broad plan without knowing the specific mechanism, the trust structure. The timing, Russell may have kept the technical details to himself. He's the one who would have understood the legal architecture." This changed my thinking about Diana. Not in a way that reduced what she had done, but in a way that made it more complex. A woman who had known the broad outline of a plan to use her marriage to extract assets from her husband, without knowing every technical detail, was still a person who had participated in a scheme against me. The degree of her knowledge was a question for the courts, not a question of innocence, but the specific quality of the voice on the phone, the genuine quality of it, told me something about the nature of what the 2 years had actually been, and about what Sunday's conversation was going to require of me. Sunday came. I drove back to Melbourne. I arrived at the Toorak house in the early afternoon. Diana was there. She was sitting at the kitchen table with what appeared to be legal documents spread in front of her. She looked like someone who had spent a weekend with difficult information and had not been sleeping well. I sat across from her. She said, "You need to tell me what happened." I said, "You need to tell me about the letter to your father." A silence. Her expression did something that I watched carefully. She said, "What letter?" I said, "The one in the desk in the study. The one about the trust structure and giving it 12 to 18 months. The one dated 14 months after we were married." A longer silence. She said, "When did you find it?" I said, "A year ago." She looked at me. The expression that moved across her face in that moment was the first genuinely unmanaged expression I had seen from Diana Whitmore in 3 years. Not guilt, exactly. Guilt is a specific and recognizable thing, and what I saw was more complicated than guilt. It was the expression of a person who is understood. All at once, the complete shape of a situation they had believed they controlled. She said, "You've known for a year." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you said nothing." I said, "No." Another silence. She said, "James, I want to explain." I said, "You don't need to explain. I have the documents. I have the trust analysis. I have the investigation findings about your father's financial position. I have the evidence of intent that will support the sham transaction argument. I have everything I need for both the trust challenge and the family court proceedings. What you tell me now will not change any of that." She sat with this for a long moment. She said, "What do you want?" I said what I had before you and your father decided it should belong to you. My land, my business, my name attached to the things I built, and not to a scheme I didn't know I was part of. She said, "And us." I said, "There is no us. There hasn't been an us since the letter." She looked at me for a long time. I looked back. She said, "I did not know it had gone as far as it did. My father." I said, "Diana." She stopped. I said, "Your name is on the letter. Your handwriting. Your plan. What your father understood and didn't understand about the legal mechanism is for your lawyers to argue. What you understood is clear." She looked at the documents in front of her. She said, "What happens now?" I said, "Your lawyers call Peter. We proceed through the courts. That's what happens now." I stood up. I went upstairs. I packed what I needed for the following weeks. I went back downstairs, walked through the kitchen where Diana was still sitting at the table with the documents in front of her, and said, "I'll be at the Laverton property if you need to reach me through the lawyers." I walked out of the house in Toorak that I had bought with my money, and I got in the car, and I drove. The legal proceedings took 14 months. I want to give you the honest version of those 14 months, which means giving you both the legal account and the personal account, because they were different. And both were real. The legal account is the cleaner of the two. The trust challenge succeeded on the procedural ground in the 4th month of the proceedings. Caroline Ng had identified the deficiency with precision and had argued it with the specific technical competence of someone who had done this many times and who knew exactly which elements of the argument the court would find persuasive. The trust was set aside. The assets reverted to my direct ownership. The primary mechanism of Diana and Russell's scheme ceased to exist as a legal instrument. This was the most significant single outcome of the 14 months, because it removed the thing that the whole scheme had been designed to achieve. The trust had been built to give Diana a property settlement advantage in the anticipated divorce. Without the trust, the family court property settlement would be conducted on the basis of direct ownership and on the basis of direct ownership. The contribution analysis was straightforward. The assets were mine. I had built them before the marriage, over 20 years, with my own labor and capital and judgment. The 18 months of marriage, 18 months that had been directed from the beginning toward the scheme rather than toward a genuine partnership, did not generate a claim to the assets that the family court would treat as equivalent to 20 years of building. Russell Whitmore attempted to intervene in the proceedings. His counsel argued that he had a beneficial interest in the trust assets through a series of transactions that he claimed had been conducted during the marriage. These claims were not supported by documentation that withstood scrutiny. The investigation findings about his actual financial position, the distress development projects, the personal illiquidity were disclosed to the court in a way that substantially undermined his credibility as a witness. He was not, ultimately, a party to the proceedings in any way that had legal consequence. He was a man who had built a plan that failed, and the failure was documented in a court record that attached to his name and to his daughter's name in a permanent and public form. Diana's settlement was significantly less than what she and Russell had planned for. The family court, in the absence of the trust structure and in the presence of the evidence of the scheme, assessed her contribution to the marriage and the assets in a manner that reflected the reality of what the marriage had been, rather than the fiction of what she had presented it as being. She received a settlement that was appropriate to 18 months of marriage without significant financial contribution. It was not nothing, but it was not what they had planned, and the gap between what they had planned and what they received represented, as I understood it, the difference between Russell Whitmore's financial survival and his financial reckoning. Russell Whitmore's business did not survive the year after the proceedings concluded. The financial pressure that the failed scheme had been intended to resolve was not resolved. And without the resolution, the distress development projects followed their natural trajectory. He was not bankrupted in the formal sense he managed, through asset sales, to avoid that specific outcome. But the business he had spent 30 years building was substantially reduced, and the social position that he had maintained through the careful management of appearances was significantly damaged by the public record of the family court proceedings and the trust challenge, both of which were accessible to anyone with an interest in examining them. This was not something I had planned for. I had planned to recover what was mine. The consequences for Russell's position were the natural result of the exposure of what he had done, and I did not engineer them. But I am not going to pretend they were not satisfying, because pretending they were not satisfying would be dishonest, and the account I am giving you is the honest one. The personal account of the 14 months is the harder one to give. What the legal proceedings involved, in personal terms, was the sustained experience of a process that exposed something I had believed was private, the failure of a marriage, the specific and personal damage of a betrayal that had been intimate in the most complete sense to public scrutiny. Family court proceedings in Australia are, for the most part, conducted without public access to the specific details. But the trust challenge in the Supreme Court was a different matter, and the combination of the two proceedings and the investigation findings that were disclosed in both produced a level of attention from people in my professional and personal world that I had not fully anticipated. People who knew me professionally, other people in the mining and exploration industry, people who had worked with my consultancy, people I had known in the industry for 20 years became aware, through the proceedings and through the press coverage that attended the trust challenge, that my marriage had been what it had been. This awareness arrived in various forms, the calls from people who had heard things and wanted to understand what had happened, the awkward silences at industry events where people were uncertain how to acknowledge what they knew, the occasional direct expressions of support that were genuine and that I received with more gratitude than I was able to express in the moment. The thing I found most difficult about this period was not the legal process, or the public attention, or even the ending of the marriage, which had ended emotionally long before it ended legally. It was the specific and private work of revising my understanding of 3 years, the 18 months before the wedding, and the 14 months of the marriage, in light of what I now knew about what those 3 years had actually been. This revision is harder than it sounds. When you understand that a relationship was, at least in significant part, a strategy being pursued by the other person rather than the mutual thing you believed it to be. The understanding does not arrive as a clean replacement of the false version with the true one. It arrives as a permanent uncertainty about which parts were real and which parts were not. And the uncertainty does not resolve because the evidence that would resolve it is not available to you. You have the letter. You have the trust documents. You have the investigation findings. You have the evidence of the scheme. What you do not have is the ability to distinguish. In the 3 years of your experience of the relationship, between the parts that were genuine and the parts that were performance. I have sat with this uncertainty for the years since the proceedings concluded, and I have not resolved it. I have arrived at a version of it that I can live with, which is not the same as resolution. The version I can live with is this, that Diana Whitmore was a person who had genuine qualities: warmth, competence, social intelligence, and who had also, at some point, made a decision to use those genuine qualities in the service of a scheme that was designed to harm me. The genuine qualities did not become false because of the scheme. The scheme did not become less harmful because some of what had been genuine was real. Both things were true simultaneously, and the simultaneous truth of them is the honest account of what those 3 years were. I can live with that account. I have had to. The lithium tenements on the Laverton property were confirmed by a third-party technical assessment commissioned by one of the AIX-listed exploration companies that had expressed interest in the early stage of the proceedings. The assessment was released publicly in the 8th month of the legal proceedings. The confirmed resource was larger than my own estimates had suggested, and the market responded to the confirmation in the way that lithium discoveries were responding to the market in that period with enthusiasm. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the timing of the resource confirmation relative to the legal proceedings was, in its effect, significant, and I do not want to present it as something I engineered when it was something I had anticipated but not controlled. I had known, when I made the decision to contest the divorce and the trust structure, that the lithium tenement assessment was likely to confirm value within the window of the proceedings. This is partly why the timing mattered. The scheme Diana and Russell had built was designed to force a settlement before the resource value was confirmed, because the confirmed resource value was going to make the asset base considerably more significant than the pre-confirmation estimate. By contesting the proceedings and building the counterstructure that delayed any resolution until after the confirmation, I had preserved the full value of the asset base. Not through strategy in the narrow sense. I could not control the timing of the exploration company's assessment or its results, but through the decision to fight. And to fight correctly, and to fight long enough that the timing worked in my favor rather than against it. The Laverton property, post-confirmation, was valued for the family court proceedings at a figure that was approximately twice what it had been valued at in Diana's original asset disclosure. This discrepancy, the gap between the value disclosed in Diana's asset schedule and the value established by the technical assessment, was one of the specific things that the court took into account in its assessment of the credibility of Diana's presentation of the assets. People in the industry called. In the weeks after the technical assessment was released, some of them wanted to understand the resource. Some of them wanted to express, in the indirect way of industry people, something that approximated congratulation without quite having the personal directness of that word. One of them, a man I had known for 15 years, who had worked in lithium exploration in Western Australia since before lithium was what it became called, and said I read the assessment. "You were right about Laverton 10 years ago." I said I was right about what was in the ground. I was wrong about some other things. He laughed, which was the right response. I visited the Laverton property the weekend after the technical assessment was released. Not to celebrate celebration is not the right word for what I felt about any of it, which was something more complex and more mixed than celebration. I visited because it was what I did when I needed to think, and I needed to think about what came next. What came next was the conclusion of the proceedings, the settlement, the formal end of the marriage, and then the question that I had been deferring across 2 years of fighting for the land and the assets, of what I was going to build next and how. I stood on the Laverton property in the specific October light of the Western Australian spring, the land green from early rains, the breakaways lit gold in the afternoon, the mulga moving slightly in a wind that smelled of the country in a way that no other smell resembles. And I thought about my father. He had left me 2 things. The $400,000 had become the consultancy, and then the properties, and then the $45 to $70 million that the scheme had been designed to capture. The 320 acres near Menzies had become, through my 20 years of attention and improvement, something considerably more significant than he had left me. Both of these outcomes were the product of sustained work, not dramatic work, not heroic work, but the specific and unglamorous accumulation of a person who shows up every day and does the thing the day requires for 20 years. I thought about what he would have made of the 2 years. He was not a demonstrative man. He would not have said anything dramatic. He would have listened to the whole account, the letter, the trust documents, the proceedings, the confirmation, and he would have been quiet for a moment, and then he would have said something brief and practical and exactly right. I did not know what specifically, I knew the form of it. I thought I held the land. That would have been enough for him. It was enough for me. Yeah! I want to tell you about Peter Carmichael, because he is the person who made the most difference across the 2 years and who has received the least prominent account. Peter was 61 when the Tuesday in July happened, and 63 by the time the proceedings concluded. He had been a property solicitor for 35 years, and in 35 years, he had developed the specific quality of an excellent solicitor, the ability to hear a client describe a situation and to understand, almost immediately, what the situation actually required, which is not always the same thing as what the client initially believes it requires, what I had initially believed the situation required. On the afternoon I walked into his office with the letter was a quick legal countermove that would protect the most immediate vulnerability. What Peter understood was that the situation required something more comprehensive, a full understanding of the scheme before any counter-move was made, and a counter-structure that addressed the full scope of what had been built rather than only its most visible element. He had given me, in our first meeting, advice that was going to be difficult to follow and that was absolutely correct. He had said, "Do nothing until we understand everything," and he had meant it fully, not nothing dramatic, not nothing obvious, but nothing at all. No changes to behavior, no changes to routine, no conversations with Diana that signaled awareness of what I knew. Nothing. This advice was correct, and it was costly, and I followed it, because Peter had been right about property situations for 35 years, and I trusted him more than I trusted my own instincts in the immediate aftermath of the letter. The instincts of a man who has just understood what his marriage actually was are not reliable for complex legal strategy. The judgment of a solicitor with 35 years of experience and no emotional investment in the situation is considerably more reliable. I am aware that trusting Peter Carmichael was the right decision in a way that is clear only in retrospect that I could not have known, when I made it, that his advice was correct, only that it came from someone whose judgment I had reason to trust. This is the specific character of the decisions that difficult situations require. You make them on the basis of the best available judgment, knowing that you cannot be certain until later whether the judgment was right. I made the decision to trust Peter's judgment. The judgment was right. I have told him this, in the specific way that I tend to communicate things that matter, which is directly and without great ceremony. He received it in the specific way of a solicitor who has been at this for 35 years and who has learned to receive such things without either false modesty or excessive acknowledgement. He said the strategy was right and you executed it correctly. That's how these things work. I said you built the strategy. He said you followed it for 2 years without breaking. That's the harder part. He was right about that too. I want to tell you about one more thing before I give you the after. And it is the thing that has taken me the longest to find the right way to say to in the months after the proceedings concluded. A number of people who knew me, colleagues, friends, people who had known me for years, said versions of the same thing. They said you must be relieved. They said you must be glad it's over. They said now you can move on. I found these statements, which were offered with genuine goodwill and which I received with genuine appreciation for the goodwill, to be somewhat inaccurate in a specific way that I want to describe. What I felt at the conclusion of the proceedings was not relief. Primarily, relief is the feeling of a pressure being removed, and the proceedings had been genuinely pressurized, and their conclusion did remove that pressure. So yes, relief was present, but it was not the primary feeling, and presenting it as the primary feeling would be an inaccuracy. What I felt was something more like completion. Not satisfaction in the triumphant sense I had not triumphed over something. I had recovered something, and the recovery was not the same as triumph, because what I had recovered was what I should never have had to fight for in the first place. The completion was the specific feeling of a correct outcome to a situation that had required a correct outcome. Not perfect, not painless, but correct. The record, the assets, the name, these were where they were supposed to be. And the other thing I felt, which I want to name because it is true, even though it is uncomfortable to name a specific and durable sadness for what the 3 years had been. Not for what I had lost. I had recovered what I had lost. Or most of it. For what the 3 years had contained that was, or had seemed, genuine. And that had been used as the material of a scheme. The genuine things did not become false. They were real. They were also the instruments of the scheme, because the scheme required the genuine things in order to be convincing. And a scheme that uses genuine things as its instruments leaves a specific residue in the person who experienced those genuine things, believing in them. I carry that residue. It is lighter than it was 2 years ago. It is not gone. These two things, the completion and the sadness, exist simultaneously. And that simultaneous existence is the most accurate description of what the conclusion of the proceedings felt like. Not relief, not triumph, completion and sadness, side by side, in the specific proportion that the specific situation produced. I have learned to live in that proportion. Most days, it is a livable proportion. I sold the Turak house in the month after the proceedings concluded. Not because I needed to. The settlement had not required me to sell it. And the financial position of the asset base, post-litigation and post-confirmation, was strong enough that the house was not a financial burden. I sold it because I did not want to live in it anymore, and because the sale was the most direct expression available to me of the decision to move on. In the specific sense that moving on requires not the forgetting of what happened, but the deliberate reorientation of daily life around what is true and present rather than around what was true and is now over. I bought a property in the Grampians, a 200-acre holding with a house that needed work and land that had water and soil in the specific quality of Victorian hill country that I had always liked, without having previously had good reason to act on. The house needed work, and I did some of the work myself, on weekends, which was the kind of practical, physical engagement that I had always found useful for thinking. I was a person who thought better with his hands doing something, and the work on the Grampians' house gave my hands something to do, while my mind did the work of the after. I continued the consultancy. This is the fact about the after that surprised me most, because I had imagined, in the 2 years of the proceedings, that the conclusion of the proceedings would produce some decisive change in how I engaged with the work. It did not. I went back to the work, the assessments and the tenement analysis, and the field work, and the client relationships in the same way I had always done it. Because the work was what it had always been, and what it had always been was what I was good at and what I found genuinely engaging. The Laverton lithium tenements were the subject of a joint venture agreement with an ASX-listed exploration company in the year after the proceedings. The terms were by the assessment of people in the industry who looked at them. Very good terms. I had been patient about the terms, as I had been patient about other things, and patience in the negotiation of a joint venture agreement for a confirmed lithium resource had, in that particular year and that particular market, been rewarded. The Menzies property I kept. I always keep the Menzies property. It is not, by the standards of the other holdings, the most economically significant, but it is the first, and it was my father's, and it is the property that I walked as a boy with a man who taught me how to read the country. I will not sell it. There is no offer that would produce the conversation where I say yes, because the Menzies property is not for sale, and the reason it is not for sale has nothing to do with economics. I visit it regularly. I still stay in the station house that my father built, which is more comfortable than it was 20 years ago because I have done work on it across 2 decades. I walk the property in the mornings, the way I walked it with my father, reading the country in the way that my father taught me, and that I have added to over 20 years. The country does not change in the ways that people and markets and legal proceedings change. It changes in its own ways, over its own time frames, which are longer than any human time frame and which produce a quality of perspective that I find, every time I visit, both humbling and useful. It is the most honest relationship I have. The country does not manage what it presents to me. It is what it is, and reading it correctly requires that I also be what I am, without management or performance, or the specific work of appearing to be something I am not. This is the quality of the country that I have valued most across 20 years of working in it, and that I value most in the after of the preceding years. The land does not lie. The land is the land. Everything else is people, and people are complicated, and the complication is something you manage and live with and, eventually, find a way to carry without it defining everything else you are. I want to tell you about one conversation I had with Diana after the proceedings concluded, not because it resolved anything it did not, but because it was real, and because the real things, including the difficult real things, deserve to be part of the account. She called me 6 months after the final orders were made. I had not spoken to her since the day I had walked out of the Turak house. Her number appeared on my phone on a Saturday morning when I was at the Grampians property, and I looked at it for a moment before I answered. She said, "James, I wanted to say something that I don't think the proceedings gave me the right context to say." I said, "All right." She said, "I'm sorry. Not for the legal reasons. Not as a managed statement. I'm sorry for what I did, and for what my father did, and for the fact that the marriage was what it was. I know that doesn't change anything, but I wanted to say it." I sat with this for a moment. The morning was quiet around me, the Grampians property in early autumn. The light soft on the hills. The kind of morning that is specific to that particular landscape, and that I was. In the after. Beginning to know the way you know a place you have decided to stay in. I said, "I believe you. I also want to be honest that believing you doesn't fully change what it was." She said, "I know." I said, "Your father's situation." She said, "He's managing. It's not what he'd hoped, but he's managing." I said, "Diana, I want to ask you something and I want an honest answer." She said, "All right." I said, "Did you love me? At any point? Did any of it have anything in it that wasn't the scheme?" A long silence. She said, "Yes. The beginning. Before my father had convinced me that I understood what he was actually planning. The beginning was real. I want you to know that." I said I know. I could tell the difference, even at the end. I could tell the difference between the beginning and what it became. She said I'm sorry it became what it became. I said so am I. We said goodbye and put the phone down. I sat in the morning quiet of the Grampians' property for a long time. The beginning had been real. This is the specific thing I had needed to know and had not been able to determine from the evidence. And she had told me it was true. Not because I needed her absolution, I did not need her absolution, but because accuracy matters to me in all things, including the things that hurt. And the accurate account of the 3 years required that I know whether any of it had been genuine. Some of it had been. I held this alongside everything else, and I sat in the morning quiet, and eventually I got up and went back to work. There is a quality of mourning in the Western Australian outback that I have tried many times to describe to people who have not been there and have not fully succeeded. Because the description requires a frame of reference that only the experience itself provides. The scale of it, the specific quality of the light in the first hour after dawn, before the heat has established itself, when the country is briefly cool, and the colors are briefly soft, and the distance that is always present in that landscape has a quality that is almost contemplative. The silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that ordinary sound does not accommodate. I am in that landscape regularly. I go there when I need to think, and when I need to not think. When I need the specific perspective that only very large and very old things provide. The country has been here for an incomprehensible span of time. It has been worked over by ice ages and tectonic events, and the specific geologic processes that produce the lithium and the gold and the base metals that I have spent 20 years understanding. It will be here for an incomprehensible span of time after I am gone. This does not diminish what the scheme did. It does not diminish what the 2 years cost. It does not make the sadness smaller or the recovery more automatic. But it provides a frame that I find useful, the frame of something that is much larger than any individual situation, that continues regardless of any individual situation, and that offers, to a person willing to be present in it, a quality of perspective that I cannot find anywhere else. I built something real. In 20 years of work, it is still real. The scheme did not succeed. The land is still mine. The Menzies property is still there, in the morning light. The way it was when my father walked it, and the way it will be when neither of us can. She married me for the land. I made sure she left with nothing, and then I went back to work, which is what the land had always required, and what it will always require the person willing to show up. To read it correctly, to do the thing the day requires, and to keep going. I kept going. She married me for the land. I made sure she left with nothing. I want to tell you about the 20 years before Diana Whitmore, because those 20 years are the foundation of everything. And because a person who doesn't understand what the land cost to build doesn't understand what was worth fighting for. I started in the Pilbara at 22, which is not the romantic beginning, that people who have never been to the Pilbara might imagine. The Pilbara in the late 1990s was a specific and demanding environment, not dangerous in the melodramatic sense, but genuinely hard in the way that work is genuinely hard when the physical conditions are extreme and the margin for error is small, and the consequences of poor judgment are felt immediately and directly, rather than diffused through institutional layers. The heat was real. The distances were real. The isolation was real. And the work, the specific work of moving through a landscape and reading it for what it contained and what it might contain, was the kind of work that rewards a specific kind of attention and punishes the absence of it. I had the attention. I am not being immodest about this. I am simply being accurate. I had, from the time I was a boy walking the Menzies property with my father, the specific quality of attentiveness to landscape that is partly innate and partly cultivated by years of practice. My father had it. He had developed it not through formal training, but through the sustained practice of a man who had spent decades working with and thinking about land, what it was, what was in it, what it might become. He had passed it to me in the specific way that practical knowledge is passed between people who spend significant time together, doing the same things not through explicit instruction, but through the accumulated modeling of how a person who has the knowledge behaves in the presence of the thing they know. I spent 3 years in the Pilbara as a field geologist for a mid-sized exploration company, followed by 2 years in the gold fields and 1 year in the copper projects of South Australia. These 6 years were the formal education that my university geology degree had provided the framework for the education of doing the work in the field, making the observations, developing the models, being wrong about some of them, and understanding why, building the judgment that distinguishes between the observations that matter and the observations that don't. At 28, the year after my father died, I started the consultancy. The decision to start the consultancy was both simpler and more complicated than it might appear. The simple version: I had 6 years of field experience, a specific and demonstrable track record of identifying prospective tenements, and a professional network of contacts in the exploration industry who knew my work and who had, over 6 years, given me reason to believe that the work was valued. The consultancy was the natural next step for a person with those assets. The complicated version: my father had just died, and the Menzies property was in my name, and the $400,000 he had left me was sitting in an account, and I had spent the 6 years since university doing other people's exploration work when the thing I most wanted to do was my own. The death of my father was the specific event that made the decision actual rather than theoretical, not because it resolved any of the practical questions, but because it removed the last reason I had been deferring the decision, which was the knowledge that my father was alive and that I could, if the consultancy failed, return to employment without the failure having consequences beyond my own situation. The consultancy did not fail, not immediately, and not later. It grew, slowly in the first 3 years, and then more reliably in years 4 through 8. And then, with the specific momentum of a business that has established a reputation and is receiving the referrals that reputation generates. By year 10, I had a track record of tenement assessments that was, by any measure I could apply to it, very good. Not perfect. I had been wrong about things. I had assessed prospects as poor that had turned out to be interesting, and assessed prospects as interesting that had turned out to be poor. But the overall record was one that I was not uncomfortable presenting to a potential client. And the clients it produced were the kinds of clients whose own track records were good enough that their willingness to use my consultancy was itself a form of credibility. The land acquisitions began in the consultancy's 4th year, when the Laverton property became available and I had accumulated enough surplus to act on it. I want to tell you about the decision to buy the Laverton property, because it is the most important single land decision I made, and because the way I made it tells you something about how I operate that is relevant to understanding how the 2 years with Diana were handled. The previous owner of the Laverton property was a pastoral family who had run sheep on it for 3 generations, and who had, in the 3rd generation, concluded that the economics of pastoral farming in that region were not going to improve sufficiently to justify the continued effort. They needed to sell, and they needed to sell quickly, because the family had debts associated with the previous season's drought that required resolution before the next season began. They had listed the property at a price that reflected its value as a pastoral asset. I had assessed the property as having considerably more value than its pastoral asset base suggested, because I had read the regional geology and identified, from the surface expression and the regional structural context, a high probability zone of lithium prospectivity that was not reflected in the asking price. The lithium prospectivity was not certain it was a prospectivity assessment, not a resource estimate, but it was, by my judgment, well supported by the available data and sufficiently compelling to justify paying a premium above the pastoral value. I paid the premium. The transaction completed in a week, because the family needed the week, and I was in a position to provide it. The premium I paid was approximately 30% above the pastoral asset value. 8 years later, when the lithium resource was confirmed by technical assessment, the premium I had paid looked like the most efficient 30% I had ever spent. At the time of payment, it looked like a well-supported bet, a bet I believed in, but a bet. This is the nature of land decisions, and it is the nature of good land decisions. In particular, they look like bets from the outside and from the moment of making them, and they look like obvious correct decisions from the perspective of 10 years later. The person who makes them well is not the person who is certainty about what is in the ground is not available until the drilling tells you what is in the ground. The person who makes them well is the person whose judgment about what is likely to be in the ground is calibrated correctly over many repetitions. I had spent 20 years calibrating that judgment. The Laverton decision was the outcome. Diana Whitmore's scheme had been designed, in significant part, to capture the value of the Laverton property before the lithium resource was confirmed. The confirmation would come. They had understood, and the confirmation would substantially increase the asset value. Their window for capturing the value at the pre-confirmation figure was the period before the confirmation. The 18 months of the marriage that the letter had referenced as the timeline for moving. What they had not understood, what Russell's financial sophistication had not extended to, was that the window they were operating within was also the window I was using to build the counterstructure. Two things were happening simultaneously in those 18 months they were building toward their move, and I was building the counter to it. The difference was that they were building with the assumption that they were the only ones building. They were not the only ones building. The asymmetry of knowledge is the thing that determined the outcome. They knew what they were planning. I knew what they were planning, and what I was planning. That asymmetry, maintained across 2 years through the daily work of the performance, was worth more than any legal mechanism or financial resource that either side brought to the proceedings. I want to tell you about the property near Menzies in more detail, because the property near Menzies is the property I think about most, and the one that is hardest to explain in any terms that don't sound either sentimental or abstract. My father acquired the property in 1974 in the specific context of the Western Australian mineral boom that followed the iron ore discoveries of the 1960s, and that produced, across the goldfields region, a wave of prospecting and land acquisition by people who believed, with varying degrees of justification, that the country was worth more than its current use suggested. My father was one of those people. He had a good eye for country and a limited budget, and he acquired the Menzies property in the window between its previous owner's decision to abandon it and the market's general recognition of its value, a window that was, in the specific economic conditions of 1974 Western Australia, considerably wider than it would be today. The property did not produce what my father had hoped. The gold prospectivity that had motivated the acquisition was real, but the grade was marginal at the economics of the time. And the decision to develop it further at the prices of the 1970s and 1980s never made the calculation that would have justified the capital expenditure. He held it through 3 decades, visiting it regularly, maintaining it with the specific attention of a man who believed it was worth keeping, without being able to demonstrate that belief in the language of return on investment. I walked it with him from the age of 7. Not every year we were not a family that had the resources for regular long-distance travel, and the visits to Menzies were events rather than routines. But I walked it enough, across the years of my childhood and adolescence, to develop the specific relationship to the country that comes from sustained attention over extended time. I knew which breakaways held water after rain. I knew which of the creek beds ran reliably in winter, and which were dry except in the wettest years. I knew the patterns of the mulga and the acacia and the saltbush, and what those patterns said about the soil beneath them, and what the soil said about what was further beneath. When I inherited it, at 23, the first thing I did was spend 2 weeks walking it. Not with any commercial objective. I was working as a field geologist at the time, and my commercial attention was directed elsewhere. I walked it because it was my father's, and it was now mine, and because walking it was the way I knew to honor the fact of the transfer. I walked it with the notebooks that I always carry in the field, making observations, developing the understanding of the country that the years of childhood visits had begun, and that the years of my own professional work had given me the tools to extend. The notebooks from those 2 weeks in 1997 are still in my filing cabinet. I have referred to them several times across the 20 years since, as my understanding of the regional geology has developed, and as the economic context for the property's prospectivity has changed. The observations made in 1997 look different in the light of what I have learned since. Some of them look prescient. Some of them look like the work of a 23-year-old who was paying close attention and who got some things right and some things wrong in the proportions you would expect from a 23-year-old paying close attention. I showed the 1997 notebooks to Diana once, about 4 months into the marriage. She had asked about the Menzies property, asked with what I had understood as genuine interest, the kind of interest she was consistently good at conveying. I had shown her the notebooks because they were, in some sense, the document of how I had begun to understand the property, and because sharing them felt like the right thing to do with a person I believed I was building a life with. I thought about this during the 2 years, a number of times. The notebooks I had shared with Diana in month 4 of the marriage, whether she had passed information from them to her father, whether the prospectivity assessments I had made in 1997 and added to across the years were information that Russell had used in constructing his understanding of the asset value. I concluded, eventually, that it didn't matter. The notebooks were not strategic information, they were geological observations, not financial assessments, and their value in the context of the scheme was limited. The scheme did not require an understanding of the geology. It required an understanding of the legal structure and the financial value, both of which were available through public records and the trust documents themselves. But I thought about the notebooks because they were the thing I had shared most completely, most genuinely. In the months when the sharing had felt like something other than what it turned out to be, the notebooks were me, the working version of me, the version that existed in the field with the country, which was the version I was most myself in. Showing them to Diana had been, in the specific way that I operated, an act of genuine openness, an invitation into the most real part of my life. I did not regret showing them. The regret would have required me to wish I had been less open, and being less open would have made me someone I did not want to be. But I thought about the notebooks. They were part of the texture of what the 3 years had been and what they had cost. I want to tell you about the role of the Laverton drilling results in the timeline of the proceedings, because the technical details matter, and because most accounts of this kind of story treat the technical details as background rather than foreground. In my case, the technical details were the foreground. The first drilling campaign on the Laverton lithium anomaly had been conducted 5 years before the marriage, and had returned results that were, in my assessment, encouraging but not yet confirmatory. The lithium grades and thicknesses were above the threshold that would have suggested a mineralized system was present, but below the threshold that the market and the industry would treat as confirmed resource material. The results were enough to justify a second campaign. The second campaign required capital and time. And between the capital requirements and the operational logistics of drilling in that part of Western Australia, the second campaign had been deferred twice before the marriage, and once during the marriage. It was scheduled. At the time of the Tuesday in July, for the following February, which was approximately 8 months after I had found the letter, and which was, therefore, inside the window that Diana and Russell's plan had identified as their operative timeline. This timing was the specific strategic pressure that Peter and I had to manage alongside the legal strategy. If the drilling campaign proceeded and produced confirmatory results before the proceedings were filed, the asset value would be publicly established at a higher level before we had the legal counterstructure in place. Diana and Russell could then argue that the pre-confirmation value at the time of the scheme was the relevant benchmark, and the confirmed value was a post-scheme development that should not affect the settlement. If the drilling campaign was delayed past the proceedings, the confirmed value would arrive after the trust challenge and the family court filing, and would be assessed in the context of a proceeding that was already on foot. Peter and I made the decision, in the second month after the Tuesday in July, to delay the drilling campaign by 6 months. The delay was ostensibly for operational reasons. There were genuine operational reasons available. Because the logistics of coordinating a drilling program in remote Western Australia are complex, and delays are common, and it was managed in a way that did not signal to Diana that anything strategic was occurring. She knew about the drilling program in general terms, and she knew about the delay in the specific terms I presented to her, which were the operational terms. The delay moved the expected timing of the results to approximately 8 months after our proceedings were filed, which is exactly what happened. The results that confirmed the resource were published in the 8th month of the proceedings, in a market environment that was actively receptive to lithium discoveries, and produced a resource assessment that was incorporated into the family court proceedings as documentation of the asset's current value. The difference between the pre-confirmation estimate and the post-confirmation assessment was, in round numbers, $20 million. That $20 million, the value gap that Diana and Russell's timing strategy had been designed to exploit, was preserved by the 6-month delay in the drilling campaign. I did not tell Diana about the delay decision for strategic reasons. I told her about the delay in operational terms because those terms were accurate and because the strategic dimension was not something I was going to share with her. This is the specific character of the 2 years. There were things that were true and things that were additionally true. And the additionally true things were not shared with Diana, because sharing them would have ended the advantage that the staying quiet had given me. I have thought about whether this constitutes a form of deception. I have concluded that it does, in the narrow sense that there were things I did not tell her. I have also concluded that the deception was appropriate, because the deception was in response to a scheme that had used my trust as its primary instrument, and because the alternative transparency that allowed the scheme to succeed would have been a different and worse outcome for all of the reasons I have described. I am at peace with this conclusion, though I am also aware that people who have not been in the specific situation I was in may assess it differently. The situation required what it required. I did what it required. The outcome was correct. I want to tell you about the investigators, because the investigation was a significant part of what made the proceedings work, and because the specific qualities of good investigative work are worth describing. The firm Peter engaged specialized in financial investigation in the context of family law, disputes a specific and growing area of practice. Peter told me. Because the complexity of modern asset structures in significant family law matters had created a market for people with the specific skills to examine those structures with the required thoroughness. The lead investigator on my case was a woman named Sandra Haynes, who had spent 15 years in forensic accounting before moving into private investigation, and who brought to the work the specific combination of technical precision and investigative persistence that complex financial structures required. Sandra's work produced three things that were critical to the proceedings. The first was the detailed picture of Russell Whitmore's financial position, the distressed development projects, the personal illiquidity, the specific degree of financial pressure that motivated the urgency of the scheme. The second was documentation of the financial flows between Russell and Diana that were relevant to the scheme payments that, in isolation, could be explained as ordinary financial support from a father to a daughter, and that, in context and in combination, established a pattern of financial coordination that supported the intent argument. The third was something neither Peter nor I had anticipated, a trail of communications between Russell and the solicitor who had drafted the trust documents. The communications had not been shared with Diana's legal team in the discovery process, which was itself a discoverability issue that Caroline Eng identified and pursued, and the communications, when obtained through the court's discovery process, were explicit enough about the purpose of the trust structure to substantially strengthen the sham transaction argument. The solicitor who had drafted the trust documents was not prosecuted. The communications, while damaging to Russell's credibility and to Diana's position in the proceedings, did not rise to the level of the criminal misconduct that would have warranted a referral to the Law Society. But they were in the record, and they were public. And the public record of a solicitor's involvement in a structure that a court had found to be a sham transaction was its own consequence. Sandra's work cost money. It cost significantly more money than I had initially budgeted for the investigation. I paid it because the work was worth what it cost, and because not paying it would have meant proceeding without information that turned out to be critical. This is the specific character of good investigative work. You cannot know, before you have it, exactly what it will produce, and the decision to commission it is a bet that the production will justify the cost. Sandra's work justified the cost by a significant margin. I told her this at the conclusion of the proceedings. Which surprised her. She told me that most clients did not make a point of acknowledging the work at the end. I said the work made a significant difference. I want you to know that I know it. She received this in the specific professional way of a person who values the acknowledgement without needing it, which is the right way to receive that kind of acknowledgement. There is a question I have been asked, in various forms, by various people in the years since the proceedings concluded, that I want to address directly because it is an honest question that deserves an honest answer. The question is, do you regret the marriage? The honest answer is complicated, in the specific way that honest answers to complicated questions always are. And I want to give you the full complication rather than the simplified version that would be easier to deliver. I do not regret the marriage in the sense of wishing it had not happened. The marriage produced the scheme, and the scheme produced 2 years of the most demanding experience of my professional and personal life. and the 2 years produced outcomes that I would not have had without them. The investigation of Russell Whitmore's financial position, which the scheme required me to conduct, produced information that I used, in the years after the proceedings, to avoid a separate business situation that would have been costly. The experience of building the counterstructure with Peter Carmichael gave me a detailed understanding of the specific legal vulnerabilities in my land holdings, that I subsequently addressed vulnerabilities that the 2 years had made me aware of, and that I had corrected in a way that made the asset base significantly more defensible than it had been before the marriage. These are not the outcomes that a person who wishes the marriage had not happened would have. They are the outcomes of a person who has understood that even very damaging experiences produce knowledge, and that the knowledge is yours to use regardless of how it arrived. I also do not regret the marriage in the sense of wishing I had not loved Diana. I was in love with her in the beginning, or with the person I believed she was in the beginning, which is not a distinction that makes the love feel different from the inside. The love was real. The grief for what it became was also real. Both things are true, and neither one cancels the other. What I do regret, and I want to name this precisely rather than avoiding it, is that I did not look at Russell Whitmore more carefully before I married his daughter. The signs that Russell was the specific kind of man he turned out to be were present. In the social context in which I encountered him, in forms that I was equipped to recognize and that I did not recognize, because the context prevented me from applying the right kind of attention. I am a person who reads landscape very well. I am a person who reads people less reliably, particularly in social contexts, where the reading is complicated by relationship dynamics and managed presentations. This is a specific and real limitation, and the failure to recognize Russell for what he was, before committing to a marriage to his daughter, was the primary error of the 3 years. I do not offer this as self-criticism in a punishing sense. I offer it as an accurate account of what I got wrong, because accurate accounts of what you get wrong are the only basis for getting it right in the future. In the years since the proceedings, I have been more deliberate about applying the same quality of attention to people and to situations that I apply to landscape, not with the specific technical vocabulary of geological reading. People are not country. The reading is different, but with the same commitment to seeing what is there, rather than what the presentation suggests is there. This is not a foolproof method. No method is foolproof, but it is the most honest improvement I have been able to make. And I have made it. One last thing, about what the land means and why it was worth what it cost. I have described the land in economic terms, the asset value, the lithium resource, the property portfolio, because those terms are accurate and relevant to the account. But they are not the complete account of what the land is or why I built it. The land is the country. It is the specific and irreplaceable accumulation of a particular set of geological conditions over an incomprehensible span of time that produced this specific landscape in this specific place. When I walk the Menzies property in the early morning, I am walking in a country that was formed by processes that preceded human existence by a span of time I cannot genuinely comprehend, and that will continue to exist changed, but recognizably itself for a span of time that also exceeds genuine comprehension. This perspective is not available through the economic account. The economic account is accurate and useful and necessary, but it is not the thing that made the land worth fighting for in the way that I fought for it, not merely as an asset to be preserved, but as a thing that was genuinely mine, in a sense that no legal proceeding could fully capture, and no legal proceeding could fully take away. The scheme Diana and Russell built was designed to transfer the economic value of the land. That was its object. The money, the asset base, the financial position. What it could not touch, what no scheme of that kind can touch, was the relationship to the land that comes from 20 years of walking it, reading it, understanding it in the specific way that sustained attention produces. That knowledge was mine before the scheme, and it remained mine through the scheme, and it is mine now. It does not appear on any balance sheet. It is not divisible. It cannot be transferred. The land produced its value because I understood it. The understanding is mine. The land is mine because the understanding is mine, and because the fight made the legal record reflect what was already true. She married me for the land. She could not have the understanding. She could only try for the economic expression of the understanding. Which was the asset value? I held both. The land is still mine, and every morning I am at Menzies, or at Laverton, or at the Grampians' property. I walk the country in the early light, and I read what is there, and I think about what it says about what is beneath. And the thinking is the same as it has always been. And the land does not care about schemes or proceedings, or any of the human things that were done around it and through it across the 2 years. The land is the land. Everything else was always going to pass. I have been asked whether I would do it differently, whether the 2 years of staying quiet, of performing the husband that Diana believed she still had, of sitting across dinner tables and attending social events and taking phone calls from Russell Whitmore and managing every interaction with the specific discipline of a person who knows something that the people around him don't know, whether I would choose all of that again. Knowing what it cost. I have thought about this question with the seriousness it deserves, because it is not a rhetorical question, and the honest answer is not straightforward. The strategic answer is yes, without significant reservation. The 2 years produced the outcome they were designed to produce. The trust challenge succeeded. The family court settlement was correct. The lithium resource was confirmed within the proceedings and assessed at full value. The investigation produced the evidence of Russell's financial position and the intent documentation that supported the sham transaction argument. Everything the 2 years were designed to accomplish was accomplished. From a strategic perspective, the choice was correct. The personal answer is less clean. The 2 years cost more than the strategic account suggests. Not primarily in terms of resources, the legal fees, the investigation costs, the professional time that was directed toward the proceedings rather than toward the work of the consultancy. Those costs were real, but they were recoverable. The less recoverable cost was the personal one. The sustained maintenance of a performance across 2 years of daily life. The specific loneliness of operating in that mode. The revision of my understanding of 3 years that the discovery of the scheme required. I emerged from those 2 years different from how I entered them. Not in the ways that people mean when they say that, not harder, not more cynical, not less willing to trust. Those would be the wrong kinds of different. I emerged with a more precise calibration of the difference between what I am good at and what I am less good at, and with a more deliberate commitment to applying the quality of attention I bring to landscape to the other domains of my life. This is, I think, a genuine gain, not a comfortable one. Not a gain that I would have chosen to acquire in this way if other ways had been available, but a gain. The other thing that 2 years changed was my relationship to patience. I had always been patient in the specific sense that the mining and exploration industry requires the patience of a person who understands that the timelines of geological processes and economic cycles are longer than individual preferences, and who has organized his working life around the acceptance of those timelines. This is a professional patience, a patience about outcomes rather than about daily conditions. What the 2 years required was a different kind of patience, the patience of daily conditions, the patience of being in a specific set of circumstances, every day, that were not what they appeared and could not be changed until the right moment, and of maintaining in those circumstances the quality of presence and engagement that the strategy required. This isn't the patience of performance under sustained pressure. Overextended time was something I had not previously tested at this scale or under these conditions. I know, now, that I am capable of it. Not comfortably, I do not find it easy, and I would not choose to exercise it again if the choice were available. But capable. The knowing is grounded in the doing, which is the only grounding that matters. I am. In the years since, a different kind of careful than I was before, not suspicious. I do not move through the world looking for the scheme in every interaction, but careful in the specific sense of paying more deliberate attention to what the evidence actually shows, rather than to what the context suggests it shows. This is, I think, the most practical improvement the 2 years produced. The land is the same. The land has not changed. The country that I walk in the early morning on the Menzies property is the country my father walked, and it will be the country of whoever walks it after me. And it holds all of our attention and none of our dramas in the equanimity of a thing that is much larger and much older than any of it. I am grateful for the land, not in a sentimental way, in the specific and grounded way of a person who understands what the land cost to acquire and what it would have cost to lose, and who has kept it. She married me for the land. I made sure she left with nothing, and the land is still here, in the morning light, exactly as it was. That is the complete account. That is enough. I want to describe one specific morning at the Menzies property, because it is the morning I think about when I need to remember what the 2 years were for. It was in April, 6 months after the final orders were made. I had driven up from Kalgoorlie the previous evening and arrived in the dark. The stars over the goldfields in their usual extravagance. The air cold and dry and smelling of the country in the specific way that April brings. I had made dinner from what I had brought, eaten it at the table in the station house that my father had built, and gone to bed early. I woke before dawn. This is what I always do at Menzies. The station house has a quality of darkness and quiet that produces a very complete sleep. And the sleep ends at the point where the body has taken what it needs and is ready to be in the world again. I made tea. I put on my boots and my coat. I went outside. The pre-dawn at Menzies in April has a specific quality that I have been trying to describe for 20 years and have never fully succeeded. The cold is the real cold of the goldfields in autumn, not the theatrical cold of southern cities, but the genuine cold of a place where the temperature drops quickly after sunset, and where the absence of cloud cover and humidity mean the drop is uncushioned by the atmosphere. The stars in those last minutes before the sky lightens are very clear and very numerous. The Milky Way running from the northeast to the southwest in a band that makes the sky look like something constructed rather than natural. I walked east, toward the low breakaway country that makes up the eastern boundary of the property. This is the walk I have made more times than I can count. Across 30 years of visiting the property, I know it the way I know very few things in the world completely, in the sense of having paid the kind of sustained and repeated attention to it that produces genuine knowledge rather than familiarity. I know where the rabbit warrens are, and where the red kangaroos camp at night, and where the galas come to drink in the afternoons. I know which of the breakaway walls hold the best geology, and which areas of the Mulga Flat have the soil chemistry that suggests alteration at depth. I know the property the way my father knew it, and the way I have extended his knowing across the years of my own walks. That morning in April, in the first light, I stood at the top of the main breakaway and looked east across the country. The light was coming from the east in the specific way that light comes in the outback at dawn, not gradually, not in the softened way of more humid places, but in a kind of arrival, the sky going from the deep violet of the last stars to a pale gold in what seems. Every time, like a very short span of time, I stood at the top of the breakaway, and I looked at the country. And I thought about nothing in particular, not the proceedings, not the lithium, not Diana or Russell or the trust challenge or Peter Carmichael or any of the specific elements of the 2 years. I thought about the country, in the specific and wordless way that you think about a thing you love when you are in its presence, and nothing else is required of you. The country was the same as it had always been. The breakaway was the same. The Mulga Flat was the same. The dry creek bed that wound through the southern end of the property was the same. The scheme had not changed any of it. The proceedings had not changed any of it. The 2 years had not changed any of it. The country existed before any of it, and it existed after, in the patient and complete way that country exists, which is the most complete way that anything exists. I stood there for a long time. Then I walked back to the station house and made breakfast, and went to work. The country was still mine. The morning was still mine. That was and remains enough. Every morning I go to work carrying the knowledge that the land is still mine, not as a triumphant thought. Triumph is not the right register for it. As a simple and grounding fact, the land that my father acquired in 1974, that I walked as a boy, that I inherited at 23 and spent 20 years extending and understanding, it is still mine. The scheme failed. The counterstructure held. The record is correct. The land is mine, and the morning is mine, and the work is mine, and I go to it every day with the same quality of attention that I have brought to it for 20 years. Because that quality of attention is what the work requires, and what the land deserves, and what I am most completely myself when I am providing. That is the full account. She married me for the land. I made sure she left with nothing. And then I went back to the country, which does not care about any of it, and which will be there long after all of us are gone. In the morning light, exactly as it was. That is enough. I think about Russell Whitmore sometimes. Not with anger. The anger resolved itself across the 14 months of the proceedings and left behind something that is neither forgiveness nor resentment, but a cooler and more precise thing understanding. I understand Russell Whitmore. I understand how a man who has spent 30 years in the gray areas of property development, who has made a practice of operating where the letter of the law is technically complied with and the spirit of it is not, comes to believe that this practice is simply how the world works. I understand how a man in financial difficulty, looking at a son-in-law with a $45 to $70 million asset base and a daughter who can provide the access, constructs the reasoning that makes the scheme feel like an opportunity rather than a wrong. I understand all of this. Understanding it does not reduce what it was. The understanding and the wrongness coexist in the same way that the genuine parts of the 3 years and the scheme coexist, not resolving each other, not canceling each other, simply both present and both true. Russell Whitmore's business did not survive. This was not an outcome I engineered. It was the natural consequence of the exposure of the scheme and the financial pressure that the failure of the scheme did not relieve. I did not celebrate this outcome because I do not celebrate the collapse of things that people have built, even when the people who built them did something that deserved consequence. I noted it, as I note facts, and I moved on. Diana, I think about less than Russell. This is partly a function of the conversation I described the Saturday morning call. The acknowledgement that the beginning was real, the specific information that gave me what I needed to complete the accurate account of the 3 years. After that conversation, I had what I needed, and the need to think about her diminished accordingly. I think about her occasionally, in the way that you think about people who were genuinely present in your life for a significant period, and who are now absent, not with longing or with anger or with any of the dramatic emotions that the account of the scheme might suggest should attend thoughts of her. With the quiet acknowledgement of a chapter that is concluded, that was, in its conclusion, resolved into the accurate record that it deserved. I think about the notebooks I showed her. Sometimes, the 1997 notebooks from the first 2 weeks of walking the Menzies property after my father died. They are still in the filing cabinet. They are still the same notebooks they were when I showed them to her. And the observations in them are still the observations I made at 23. Accurate in some ways, and incomplete in others, in the proportion you would expect from a 23-year-old paying close attention. They are mine. They have always been mine. The showing of them was mine to give, and was not diminished by what she did with what I gave her. Genuine openness is not made less genuine by the subsequent actions of the person it was extended to. It was real at the time. It remains real in the record of what happened. That is enough. The land is the thing that does not change. I said this before, and I want to say it again, in slightly different form. because it is the most important thing, and important things deserve repetition in different forms until the most useful form is found. The country I walk at Menzies and at Laverton, and in the Grampians, is the same country it was before the marriage, and during the scheme, and throughout the proceedings and after. It has not been altered by any of the human events that occurred around it. It will not be altered by any human events that occur around it in the future. The geological processes that produced it will continue to act on it across time scales that make the 2 years look like a breath. And the landscape that results will be recognizably the same landscape, bearing the same mineral expression of the same deep structure, walked by whoever comes after me with whatever quality of attention they bring. I bring as much attention as I can, as often as I can, because the attention is the relationship, and the relationship is what makes the land mine, in the sense that matters beyond the legal and the economic. Any person can own land in the legal sense. The land is mine, in the sense that I know it, that 20 years of sustained and genuine attention have produced in me an understanding of this specific country that is part of who I am, in a way that legal title alone cannot produce or transfer. This is what Diana and Russell could not have. They could have had the legal title. They could not have had the knowing. And the knowing is the thing that will be here, in me, for as long as I am here. And that will be expressed in the land itself, in the decisions I have made about it, the tenements I have pegged, the programs I have run, the value I have identified and begun to realize long after I am gone. The scheme failed because it misunderstood what it was trying to take. It was trying to take an asset. What the asset was built from was not transferable. I held the land. I hold it still. That is the complete and honest account of what happened, and what it means. I am done.